So we have free market capitalism in much of the world. Is it a good or a bad thing? This is a look at Mumbai. You can see a dividing line amongst the economic growth. You've got lots and lots of tent living, basically. So we have growth alongside poverty, and in fact that's a hallmark of economic growth in capitalist economies, is huge amounts of growth and at the same time huge amounts of inequality. The human hockey stick of prosperity, or the human hockey stick of growth, looks at the data basically of the economic growth sort of taking off in most countries. So how does this happen? We're going to be looking at inequality and why economic growth happens in some places earlier than others, what the technological revolution had to do with it, what's capitalism got to do with it, how should we think about the government in these capitalist or free market economies, and then the tools, right? So never confuse the tools with the theory. The tools just help us answer the questions that we're posing in the theory. The interesting questions are like, why capitalism? Is it good for us? Was it good then and not good anymore? Are the problems outweighing the benefits? And to answer those questions, we've got to have tools that help us make sense of standards of living, economic growth, human well-being, and that's why we have these tools. So gross domestic product per person or per capita, that's something that we use to look at, do we have more stuff than we used to? We want to also talk about how we look at growth rates, what kind of data we could use. And then early on, and be very careful with this, is we don't want to confuse causality with correlation, right? And an interesting example is people that watch a lot of television tend to be heavier, right? They tend to have more propensity to obesity. So you might look at those two sets of data and say, well, TV watching causes fatness, right? But that would be wrong, because what we're missing is a missing variable, which is that TV watching also means that you're exercising less, you're actually burning fewer calories, etc. So they are correlated, but simply watching a screen does not put more fat cells in your body. So we want to be careful about that. In economics, we have very few laboratory experiments that we can do to test whether things are causally related rather than just correlated. And so we take advantage of natural experiments. When recessions happen, we look at what happened right before the recession. So let's turn first to inequality. So how unequal is the world? This is a very dense diagram, so let's unpack it. But basically, if you line up countries from left to right, you have poorer countries on average, richer countries on average on the right. And then if you go front to back, you see how that income, the average income of the country, is split up between all the different levels of people. So you can see in a country like the US, it's stacked up so that a lot of people get lower incomes and then a few people get a lot of the incomes. And countries like India, there's also concentration of income to a few people. The countries that are steeper here, like China, have more inequality, and the countries that are less steep, like Norway, it's more of a graduated rise. Those countries have less inequality. Over time, inequality has risen, both between countries and within countries, right? So 1,000 years ago, the world was relatively flat, small differences between countries. And then in 1980, we start to see this divergence between countries. And in 2014, there's even more divergence. So some countries are clearly outpacing others in economic growth and getting rich. So in the toolkit of economists, one of the key things for us to understand whether capitalism is good, how to think about inequality, is to look at the gross domestic product per person, or GDP per capita. And GDP is basically the monetary value of all the stuff, goods and services we produce in a year in a given country. And oftentimes, because of differences in cost of living between countries, we want to use what's called the purchasing power parity. It's very technical, but basically looking at adjusting for differences in cost of living. GDP is not a perfect measure of how well off a country is, right? You could have a very high GDP country like Saudi Arabia that actually your average person is not that well off because it's concentrated in the hands of a few elites, or GDP can be high, but the environmental cost is very high as well, right? So GDP counts only production. It doesn't count the distribution, who's getting it, or the cost of that production. So economic growth, the modern miracle of modern, large, rich cities. What's up with that? So the timing of growth, it takes off at different points for different countries, like we've already said. Britain, one of the first countries to really experience sustained economic growth, 1650. In Japan, it's a little bit later. For China and India, it's even later than that. And something that needs to be brought up now and probably shades everything that we're talking about is colonization. So a lot of times you don't get until the second half of the 20th century that countries get independent of colonial rule. So growth rates. The GDP growth rate, or any growth rate, is a percent change from one year to the next, right? So if you gain 20 pounds of weight in a year, you want to know what percent is that? You compare that to your base weight, right? So basically you want to look at the change. If you gain 20 pounds and you started out at 200 pounds, you say that is the 20 pound change from 200 to 220, so that's 220 minus 200 over your starting point, 200. So you've gained 10% of your weight, because then you multiply it by 100% to move the decimal point over. And the reason that we care about percent changes, obviously, is because it helps us compare apples to apples in units. So let's talk about technological progress. We want to make a distinction between new technologies and more technologies. So technology, first of all, is the process of taking a set of materials to produce an output, right? The way that you do that. So technology for gutting fish, right, might change over time, but basically it is how you take your workers and machines and you prepare fish for being eaten. And technological progress is seen usually as reducing the amount of inputs to get a given output, or with the same inputs getting more output. So let's talk about the capitalist revolution. Capital goods. So let's unpack some of these terms here. Capital accumulation means getting more capital goods. What are capital goods? Goods required to produce other goods and services. Oftentimes I'll call them human-made aids to production. This computer that I'm making this video at right now is a piece of capital. The TV or computer that you're watching this at is a piece of capital, right? So Industrial Revolution is a huge amount of capital goods, right? The factories, the water wheels, the steam engine, the cotton gin, the spinning jenny, all these things that really ramped up, especially textile production, happen. It's an explosion of new capital goods. And not only did we get better capital goods, higher technology, right? New technologies that require less work to get a yard of calico cloth, but also more. Firms didn't just invent the sewing machine, but they also piled on sewing machines, so every worker has a sewing machine. So better capital, more capital. That's the story of the Industrial Revolution, and both things are important. Poor countries getting more capital, that's a huge part of growth. Rich countries already have a lot of capital, so they cannot get more growth necessarily just from adding more capital. They have to get economic growth. Countries like the US and European countries, their growth rates are usually slower because they're already saturated in capital, and what they need to do is get better capital, right? So invention and innovation is more important in rich countries than it is in poor countries. Characteristics of the capitalist economy. It's striking that firms can be born and can die pretty quickly. So that's something very different than families or governments. And so you can almost march through time here and look at how it used to be self-sufficient family-based production. The economic system was every family would take care of their own needs, so to speak. And then you moved to what in England is called cottage industries, where there were markets, but you produced stuff at home and then you sold it on eBay. Not eBay, but something like that, right? You took it to market. And now we have even more specialization, where firms are specialized producers of a certain type of thing, Q-tips, for instance. So the capitalist economic system is increasingly more specific and more specialized. And that's where a lot of the economic growth is. New technologies, but increased specialization. Adam Smith had a story of the pin factory. If each of us had to make our own pins, no, we don't use pins all that much anymore, but let's say, underwear. We would have a lot less than if specialty firms who can buy specialized equipment, who can train their workers to be very fast at a specific task, and probably those workers are just doing the elastic waistband, right? Each worker has a very specific thing to do. So that is a source of a lot of economic growth, in that firms can rise up the learning curve on how to make things. And so basically the processes get more efficient. The capitalist revolution also, you want to think about, has the potential to make people better off through the fact that firms are now competing with each other. Remember Adam Smith's invisible hand. You have to have self-interest plus competition. That's a necessary ingredient for capitalism. Firms have a strong incentive to get better with technology, right? Because technology, in a sense, can cut costs. Remember, technology reduces the amount of inputs needed for each output, and so that cuts cost. So firms, you start this process of firms always looking for new technology. There's that innovation that we need for further economic growth, right? And specialization that we've already talked about. As firms grow and seek new markets for their goods, right? That has some nice knock-on effects, like the creation of roads and bridges and communication technologies so that firms can sell their products overseas, for instance. But that benefits all of us because now we have the telegraph, we have transatlantic communication lines, we have the internet now. These are all parts of like infrastructure that help in many ways. So we've just been outlining that the hockey stick of growth happens because of capitalism, but we don't actually have a laboratory to test that. There are a few natural experiments that can help us. For instance, the division of Germany at the end of World War II into two separate economic systems that were, prior to this, equal, right? The same language, the same types of firms, etc. And we can look at West Germany, right, post-war. The trajectory is pretty solid and high. And whereas East Germany, that's this sort of plum-colored one, certainly East Germany doesn't seem to have grown quite as quickly as West Germany, but we can't chalk that all up to communism or socialism in the East and capitalism in the West, because they didn't actually start at the same level. So that sort of narrative that, well, just look at Germany. West Germany is so much richer than East Germany. Capitalism rules. socialism drools is not an honest look at the data. So, lest we think there's this monolithic one type of capitalism, one size fits all, let's get over that. There's quite a few. You have capitalism, you have state capitalism, you have capitalism with democracy, there's all sorts of different ways to do capitalism, right? You don't necessarily need democracy with capitalism. Capitalist countries are not equally successful. That's because a lot of things go into economic growth. Your economic conditions, your political conditions, the amount of corruption by your leaders, for instance, how much education and infrastructure, these very expensive things that oftentimes governments have to help fund. There's different amounts of those. And you can see in 1950, GDP per capita in South Korea is the same as Nigeria. Nigeria is here in blue, and South Korea in green. And then currently, they're very different, right? They're both capitalist countries, and now South Korea is 10 times richer than Nigeria, and Nigeria is an oil-rich country. So what is it that makes South Korea better off than Nigeria? That's no simple answer. That's a whole wing of economics called development economics, and it's a crucial study. Economic conditions that generally are aligned with or correlated with, not causing, but correlated with economic success are secure private property, not just laws, but enforcement of those laws, right? Competitive markets, not monopoly, and meritocracy. And if you're not familiar with the term meritocracy, it's the idea that those that get ahead do so on merit rather than who they know or rather than luck or anything else. So hard work or natural skill, these things are usually what people mean by a meritocracy. If you get ahead because you have more of those things, that's called a meritocracy. We'll have much more to say about meritocracy, whether it truly exists anywhere. But the political conditions, how much infrastructure and support government does for markets, laws and regulations, again, the laws, but also the enforcement of the laws. There are many countries that have great environmental laws, but no enforcement of those laws. So effectively, they have no environmental laws, right? Because firms will always find it cheaper to throw their pollution just out in the street than to clean it up. And so if they're not forced to clean it up, profit-seeking institutions like firms will always try to increase profit by escaping some of their costs. Taxation and other interventions, this also is a political condition that matters for capitalism and how dynamic capitalism is. So when is capitalism dynamic? Here's the summary. For when private incentives for innovation happen, when public policy supports those, and when public policy government supplies things like education, infrastructure, basic research, etc. So you can think about this as when the government lays the roads and makes it safe for people to trade with each other and to innovate, and the rewards for their innovation are protected, that's when you see more economic growth, basically. So I said a minute ago that capitalism does not necessarily need democracy. You could look at current China, right? Not completely capitalist, but a lot more so than they ever have been before. That's state capitalism. Democratic capitalism, practiced in Europe, practiced in the US, ideally, and nobody's saying we have a perfect democracy here by a long shot, but the idea is voting political power is given to all citizens. There is freedom of speech, assembly, and freedom of the press, under attack in many countries right now, and that leaders are selected by means of election. And you can see that capitalism emerged in a lot of rich countries long before democracy ever did. So capitalism and environmental sustainability, technological progress may be part of the solution, probably is part of the solution, by making it possible to use less resources or different resources to produce more output. Instead of oil, solar, wind, whatever. And the effects on the environment of economic growth are both because of the size of economic growth, the amount of stuff we produce, but also how we produce it, right? So some people like to think that we need to shut down economic growth altogether. I think most economists would disagree with that, because there are lots of large changes we can make in how we produce energy, for instance, how we produce food, that would have market effects on the atmospheric CO2 and global warming without cutting into economic growth very much. So, but it's a difficult thing, right? Thinking about environment and capitalism together is super hard, especially in democracies. Because we have to vote on our policies, right? And these policies go into future generations, so we have to count the costs and benefits not just for us, but for the future. Also, the costs and benefits go beyond us. So we think about national costs, but global benefits. We're not very good decision makers when it comes to decisions that don't present us with all the costs and benefits in ourselves right now. So we think about how to make this decision better. There are all sorts of solutions out on the, in tables about global environmental conferences, global environmental agreements like the Paris Accord, or before it, the Kyoto Protocol. So these are ways to try to get beyond this known problem of democracies never voluntarily or rarely voluntarily imposing costs on themselves, for which some of the benefits go to other people, either future beneficiaries or beneficiaries in other countries. So this example is something of external effects, right? That, God bless you, when an action taken by a person has consequences beyond themselves, like secondhand smoke, or like not wearing a mask in COVID, that are felt by others. Right? It's difficult to get people to take on extra costs, even though the benefits might be very large, because the benefits are felt to other people. So in sum, we looked at inequality between countries. We looked at the relationship between growth and progress. We talked about capitalism and its key ingredients, and then talked about some of the varieties of capitalism.